In the early 13th century, the lands that would one day be known as Thailand existed in the shadows of empires. Dominated by the grandeur and might of the Khmer Empire, the fertile plains and river valleys of the central and northern regions were dotted with towns and settlements that answered not to themselves, but to distant kings in Angkor. The Khmer held sway through a combination of religious authority, architectural brilliance, and military supremacy. Their stone temples pierced the sky like spears aimed at heaven, and their roads stitched together a realm that seemed impervious to change. But beneath the towering legacy of Angkor's kings, discontent smoldered in the rice paddies and village temples. In these quiet places, the people whispered in their own tongue, followed their own customs, and worshipped in a manner that diverged ever so slightly from the official decrees of their overlords. Among these people were the Thai, independent-minded, agrarian folk who had gradually migrated south from the valleys of the Yangtze, bringing with them a fierce devotion to autonomy and an egalitarian sense of leadership. Their presence, once minor, had grown steadily over the centuries, and now, by the 1230s, they formed the backbone of the population in many parts of what was then northern Siam. It was in this cauldron of growing ethnic assertion and imperial overreach that the story of Si Inthrathit began. Born as Pho Kun Bang Klang Hao, he was not raised in palaces or among gold-leafed scrolls, but in the rugged, practical world of local governance. His town, Ban Mueang, lay not far from the more prominent settlement of Sukhothai, a key provincial hub within the Khmer network. Though officially under Khmer control, the region was governed day to day by local chieftains like Bang Klang Hao and his close ally, Pho Kun Mueang of Mueang Rat. These men, though technically vassals, held real power in their domains. They led their people in times of war and peace, collected taxes, mediated disputes, and maintained religious sites. The title Pho Kun was not royal, but it was a marker of respect, bestowed upon those with a proven capacity to lead. Bang Klang Hao, by all accounts, was not a man of great ambition in his youth. He was a leader molded by circumstance, rather than thirst for power. What set him apart, however, was his profound sense of justice, his deep connection to his people, and a keen awareness of the shifting balance of power in the region. Angkor, once unstoppable, was faltering. Political intrigue and succession crises sapped its strength. Its armies were spread thin across too many frontiers, and rebellions in Kampa and in the western reaches had forced the empire into a defensive crouch. With its grip weakening, tributary regions like Sukhothai found themselves neglected, overtaxed, and underdefended. It was Pho Mueang, more outspoken and politically daring than his friend, who first articulated the possibility of independence. He had married a Khmer noblewoman and was well acquainted with the workings of the imperial court. From his position at Mueang Rat, he had watched the decline of Angkor's authority with growing interest. The two men, in their regular councils and gatherings, began to speak openly of a future where their people might no longer answer to distant kings but could chart their own destiny. They saw in each other the seeds of something larger than local rule. They saw the potential for sovereignty. But such dreams, even in the periphery of a declining empire, were dangerous. Khmer garrisons still manned the citadel at Sukhothai. Royal inspectors traveled the provinces collecting tribute and quelling dissent. Open rebellion was not only a logistical gamble but a spiritual one. The Khmer kings, after all, claimed divine sanction. To rise against them was to challenge heaven itself. Yet the Thai worldview, deeply informed by Theravada Buddhism, saw leadership as a merit-based calling rather than a divine right. If Bang Klang Hao could protect the people, bring them peace, and govern with compassion, was that not a higher legitimacy than decrees from a distant court? The final spark came from within Sukhothai itself. A Khmer governor appointed by Angkor, known for his brutal methods and extractive policies, pushed the local populace too far. Grain stores were confiscated, temples desecrated by soldiers seeking gold, and families separated by forced labor campaigns. The people of Sukhothai, who had endured for generations under imperial rule, began to rebel in small but escalating acts, failing to meet quotas, hiding livestock, sabotaging bridges. These were not coordinated actions, but they spoke to a mood of quiet revolt. When word reached Ban Khamhaeng and Ban Mueang that a military crackdown was imminent, one that would likely result in mass executions, the two men acted. They summoned their militias, consisting of farmers turned warriors, monks with staves, and hunters wielding crossbows. Their forces were not vast, but they were fighting on home soil, for a cause rooted in the hearts of every man and woman in their villages. In a coordinated strike, they moved on Sukhothai under cover of night, aided by local defectors who opened the city gates. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. The Khmer garrison, caught by surprise and unsupported by reinforcements, crumbled under the assault. Ban Khamhaeng's forces, driven not by bloodlust but by necessity, quickly secured the city with minimal bloodshed. The governor was captured and exiled. Temples were restored. Taxes were lifted. And in a moment that would echo across centuries, the people of Sukhothai assembled to name their new sovereign, not as a warlord or a tyrant, but as a protector and founder. Ban Khamhaeng accepted the crown not with pomp, but with solemn duty. He took the royal title Si Inthrathit, a name meaning glory of Indra, evoking divine strength and justice. The year was 1238. For the first time, a Thai kingdom stood on its own, independent, defiant, and self-governed. The foundations of what would become Thailand had been laid not by conquest alone, but by unity, vision, and the moral leadership of a man who had risen from among the people. Si Inthrathit had no blueprint, no imperial lineage to guide him. But he had something more enduring: the trust of his people, the support of his allies, and a burning desire to create a kingdom that belonged to those who lived upon its land. The embers of rebellion had become the flame of sovereignty. And in that light, a new nation began to take shape. The city of Sukhothai, once a provincial outpost under Khmer dominion, now stood as the seat of a fledgling kingdom. Its moats reflected not the banners of Angkor, but the newly crafted insignia of a Thai ruler. Si Inthrathit did not immediately transform Sukhothai into a grand capital, nor did he attempt to model it after the architectural splendor of Angkor Wat. Instead, he focused on practical governance, fortifying defenses, restoring irrigation systems, and encouraging the rebuilding of temples and homes that had been damaged or abandoned during the years of unrest. He knew that the strength of a kingdom was not found in its towers, but in the well-being of its people. The early days of his reign were marked by cautious optimism. The Khmer had been driven out of Sukhothai, but they still loomed large to the southeast. Their spies were everywhere, their ambitions undiminished. Si Inthrathit understood that a single victory did not guarantee lasting freedom. He needed to fortify not only his borders but the very idea of Sukhothai as a legitimate and sovereign state. To do this, he drew from the ethos of the Thai people meritocracy, community, and spiritual harmony. These values became the pillars upon which he would build a new kind of kingship. He formalized his alliance with Ban Mueang, granting him significant autonomy over his own territories while acknowledging him as a senior noble in the Sukhothai hierarchy. Their cooperation remained essential. Ban Mueang's connections to the Khmer elite allowed him to serve as both a buffer and a diplomat. Together, the two leaders formed what was, in effect, a dual structure of rule, Si Inthrathit presiding as the recognized king, and Ban Mueang acting as a powerful first among equals. It was not a centralized monarchy in the traditional sense, but it worked. It reflected the reality of Thai society, which placed great importance on consensus and mutual respect among chieftains. To cement the legitimacy of his rule, Si Inthrathit turned to religion. He invited respected Theravada Buddhist monks from neighboring regions to establish new temples and monasteries in Sukhothai. He provided land grants to Sangha communities and initiated royal patronage of important festivals. Unlike the Khmer rulers, who had embraced a syncretic blend of Hinduism and Mahayana Buddhism centered on the God-King concept, Si Inthrathit's court emphasized humility and moral leadership. The king was not a divine being, but a righteous man entrusted with temporal stewardship. This distinction, subtle though it seemed, marked a dramatic departure from centuries of Southeast Asian kingship. The shift toward Theravada orthodoxy did not only serve religious reform, it was political as well. By aligning his kingdom with the same Buddhist tradition practiced in Sri Lanka and Burma, Si Inthrathit sent a message to his neighbors and to his people. Sukhothai was part of a broader cultural world, one that valued ethical governance over divine absolutism. The monks, in turn, legitimized his authority by portraying him as a Dhammaraja, a ruler who governed in accordance with the Dharma. This partnership between the Sangha and the crown would become a defining feature of Thai kingship for centuries. As Sukhothai stabilized, Si Inthrathit began extending his influence outward. He sent envoys to nearby Thai city-states and minor principalities, offering alliances sealed by marriage or mutual defense pacts. Some accepted readily, recognizing the benefits of aligning with a strong new center of power. Others resisted, clinging to their own fragile autonomy or maintaining loyalties to the Khmer. In cases where diplomacy failed, limited military campaigns were undertaken, not with the intention of conquest but of consolidation. These early efforts gradually expanded the kingdom's footprint beyond its original core. Si Inthrathit's military doctrine emphasized speed and familiarity with the terrain. His armies were not large, but they were highly mobile and intimately acquainted with the local geography. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and psychological warfare replaced the grand siege warfare of the Khmer. In one such campaign against a rebellious principality to the west, Si Inthrathit's forces used knowledge of the seasonal flooding of rivers to trap enemy troops in marshland, forcing a swift surrender without significant bloodshed. Even as he expanded his territory, Si Inthrathit remained careful to avoid the mistakes of the empires that had come before. He did not impose rigid administrative structures on newly integrated regions. Instead, he allowed local leaders to retain much of their traditional authority, so long as they acknowledged Sukhothai's primacy and paid tribute. This federated model of governance ensured loyalty while minimizing resistance. It also preserved the cultural diversity of the region, which would later become a hallmark of the Thai identity. Internally, the king established a system of justice that emphasized reconciliation over punishment. Village elders were empowered to mediate disputes, and royal courts were only invoked in cases of serious offense. This approach reflected Thai communal values and stood in contrast to the harsh penal codes of the Khmer. The people of Sukhothai, long accustomed to fear and subjugation, began to experience something new, a sense of ownership in their own governance. But perhaps Si Inthrathit's most enduring achievement during this period was intangible. He gave the people something to believe in. The very idea that the Thai could rule themselves, speak their own language, and determine their own fate was revolutionary. Under his leadership, a collective identity began to form, not just as villagers or tribes, but as subjects of a shared kingdom. This identity would be tested, reshaped, and reimagined in the centuries to come, but it had found its genesis in Sukhothai. Meanwhile, the Khmer Empire was beginning to sense the full extent of what it had lost. Attempts to reassert control over Sukhothai were met with failure. Its military expeditions floundered in unfamiliar territory, and its agents found little support among the local populace. Worse still for Angkor, Sukhothai's example began to inspire other regions to contemplate defection. The empire's monopoly on legitimacy had been broken, and the psychological advantage it once held was fading. In the royal court of Sukhothai, Si Inthrathit remained mindful of these threats. He expanded his network of informants and fortified key border outposts. He commissioned the construction of small but strategically placed fortresses along trade routes and mountain passes. These fortifications were not meant to project power but to safeguard the fragile dream of independence. Throughout all this, the king maintained a lifestyle that was remarkably modest for a monarch. He dressed simply, often in robes similar to those worn by commoners. He held public audiences in open courtyards, not behind veils of opulence. When he traveled, he did so on horseback or in small caravans, stopping to speak with villagers, inspect irrigation works, or pray at local shrines. These gestures, far from symbolic, reinforced the image of a ruler who had not elevated himself above his people, but who had risen from among them. Children grew up hearing his name as both sovereign and father. Farmers spoke of him as the king who had ended forced labor, who had made sure their harvests went to their families, not to tax collectors. Monks revered him as a protector of the Dharma. Even his rivals, begrudgingly or not, began to acknowledge that Sukhothai was no mere rebellion. It was a kingdom, and Si Inthrathit its rightful king. As the first decade of his reign drew to a close, the borders of Sukhothai had expanded, but more importantly, so had its spirit. It was a kingdom born not of conquest, but of unity. And in the calm, deliberate leadership of Si Inthrathit, the Thai people had found not only freedom from the past but a vision for their future. He had taken up the crown not to glorify himself, but to defend the dignity of a people long overlooked. And in doing so, he became something greater than a man. He became the foundation upon which a nation could be built. The twilight of Angkor had given birth to a new dawn, and its light began in Sukhothai, where a farmer's son had dared to become a king. The rise of Sukhothai as a sovereign kingdom was not a singular event, but the culmination of years of tension, planning, and escalating confrontation. While Si Inthrathit's ascension to power in 1238 marked the symbolic birth of a new kingdom, the path to that moment was forged in resistance, in whispers of revolt carried on the wind, and in the weary eyes of those who had grown tired of serving an empire they no longer feared. For generations, the Khmer Empire had maintained a firm grip on the heartlands of the Chao Phraya River Basin. Through a combination of cultural dominance, military outposts, and a network of tributary rulers, Angkor had kept its distant territories under control. But by the early 13th century, its iron hold was weakening. Internal strife, costly campaigns in Kampa, and the sheer logistical burden of maintaining a far-reaching empire had left many of its border provinces neglected. Among these was Sukhothai, a once thriving trade center that had gradually become a forgotten outpost. The people of Sukhothai were not Khmer by blood or spirit. They were Thai with their own language, customs, and sense of justice. Though centuries of rule had introduced Khmer architecture and courtly rites, the villagers in the rice fields, the monks in the forest monasteries, and the traders in the markets all lived lives that diverged from the grand narratives of Angkor. The dissonance between ruler and ruled grew more pronounced with each passing year. Taxation intensified as Angkor's needs multiplied. Religious customs enforced from above clashed with local beliefs. Forced labor projects drained entire villages of their able-bodied men. And above all, there was a growing sense, still quiet but unmistakable, that the empire no longer inspired awe, only resentment. Si Inthrathit, then still known as Ban Mueang Hao, did not need to invent a revolution. The raw material was already there, simmering in the hearts of the people. What he did was give it form. As the local chieftain of Ban Mueang, he had long maintained a position of respect among the surrounding communities. His reputation for fairness and humility had drawn followers, and his friendship with Ban Mueang, the powerful lord of Mueang Rat, added a layer of strategic depth to his leadership. Together, the two men began to craft a vision, not merely of defiance but of self-rule. Their earliest plans were cautious. They met in secret, discussed allegiances, and mapped the positions of Khmer outposts. They counted their warriors, assessed their supplies, and carefully chose the moment when their blow would be most effective. That moment came in the early months of 1238, when intelligence from Ban Mueang's sources in Angkor indicated a diversion of troops to suppress a rebellion in the east. The governor of Sukhothai, now undermanned and overconfident, believed his command was unchallenged. He was wrong. The campaign to liberate Sukhothai began with coordinated strikes on outlying Khmer garrisons. Small Thai militias, moving under the cover of night, assaulted isolated forts and checkpoints, often aided by local villagers who provided food, shelter, and critical knowledge of the terrain. Rather than engage in pitched battles, they relied on speed and surprise, ambushes on supply caravans, sabotage of watchtowers, and psychological tactics to demoralize enemy troops. Khmer patrols, unfamiliar with the fluid tactics of their adversaries, began to suffer losses that far exceeded expectations. Panic set in. Rumors spread that the Thai were backed by supernatural forces, or that the empire's divine favor had waned. These early victories emboldened the resistance. Entire districts began refusing to pay tribute. Khmer tax collectors were turned away, their guards disarmed and their ledgers burned. Monks began preaching in Pali rather than Sanskrit, a symbolic rejection of Angkor's religious authority. Sukhothai itself, still nominally under Khmer control, became a cauldron of dissent. Secret societies flourished in its markets, and palace servants whispered messages between dissidents. When the time came for a final push, Ban Mueang and Ram Khamhaeng led their forces with swift precision. The army was not large by imperial standards, perhaps a few thousand strong, but it was unified by purpose and grounded in terrain they knew intimately. Every hill, forest, and river crossing became an advantage. The decisive confrontation took place just outside the city walls of Sukhothai. The Khmer garrison, realizing too late the seriousness of the threat, mustered its remaining forces for defense. But morale was low, and the chain of command was broken by fear and miscommunication. Thai archers harassed them day and night, cutting off food lines and isolating key watchpoints. When the final breach came, it was not through brute force but through a coordinated infiltration from within. Rebellious citizens opened gates at midnight, allowing Thai warriors to pour in. The fighting was fierce in places, especially around the citadel and the temple precincts. But by dawn, the Khmer flag no longer flew over Sukhothai. The aftermath was a moment of both triumph and solemnity. There was no bloodbath, no purge. The Khmer officials who surrendered were given safe passage out. Temples desecrated by years of neglect were restored, and a general amnesty was declared for collaborators who pledged loyalty to the new regime. This magnanimity was not weakness, it was strategy. Si Inthrathit understood that violence could fracture the fragile unity of the people. He sought to build, not destroy. And so, amid chants of freedom and offerings of lotus flowers, the people gathered in the central square to witness a coronation unlike any in their memory. Ban Mueang, dressed in the simple garments of a village elder, stood before the crowd and accepted their acclamation. He did not claim divine descent, nor did he invoke ancient prophecy. Instead, he vowed to rule as a servant of the people, to protect their lands, uphold their customs, and defend their right to speak in their own tongue. He took the name Si Inthrathit, bestowed upon him by the monks, as a symbol of his commitment to righteous rule. It was a name heavy with meaning, invoking Indra, the god of storms and kingship, and signaling a new kind of leadership, powerful yet compassionate, firm yet just. News of the liberation spread quickly, carried by traders, pilgrims, and wandering monks. In the north, Thai principalities that had long lived under the shadow of Angkor began to stir. In the west, mountain tribes sent envoys with gifts and pledges of alliance. Even in the corridors of Angkor, there was disquiet. The emperor's court dismissed the loss as temporary, but the truth was clear. The imperial facade had cracked, and worse still, Sukhothai's defiance had not collapsed into chaos, it had blossomed into governance. Over the following months, Si Inthrathit worked tirelessly to stabilize the new kingdom. He convened councils with local leaders, restructured the tax system to be more equitable, and initiated land reforms that gave farmers greater autonomy. Trade routes were secured, allowing for the influx of goods and ideas. More importantly, he encouraged the preservation of Thai oral histories and poetic traditions, laying the groundwork for a cultural renaissance that would flourish under his son, Ram Khamhaeng. But those stories were still to come. For now, Si Inthrathit walked through his kingdom not as a distant emperor, but as a present and humble king. He visited temples on foot, dined with villagers during harvest festivals, and listened to the grievances of soldiers and monks alike. His court, though modest, became a place of counsel and shared vision. Sukhothai had cast off its chains, but its survival depended on unity. And so, The king led not with a sword raised, but with a hand extended, guiding his people out of servitude and into the light of self-rule. It was a beginning forged in resistance, made sacred through restraint. The war of liberation had ended, but the labor of nation-building had just begun. With the Khmer expulsion complete and the banners of Sukhothai rising above the city walls, Si Inthrathit turned his attention toward the most challenging task of all, making independence sustainable. The war had proven that Sukhothai could fight, but peace would test whether it could govern. The victory was fresh, the wounds still raw, and the collective memory of imperial domination lingered like a shadow. If Sukhothai were to endure, could not merely survive, it had to offer something better. The king began with the symbolic reclamation of space. The Khmer temples, once adorned with images of Hindu deities and Mahayana bodhisattvas, were repurposed or rebuilt entirely in accordance with Theravada Buddhist principles. Local artisans, many of whom had been trained under Khmer patronage, now turned their skills to shaping stupas, murals, and statues that reflected a new aesthetic, one rooted in simplicity, introspection, and regional identity. The image of the walking Buddha, gentle and graceful, began to appear in temple niches and market altars, its forward motion mirroring the people's own march into a new age. Si Inthrathit encouraged the establishment of monastic schools, where children could learn not only religious doctrine, but also the principles of moral conduct, justice, and the responsibilities of citizenship. These institutions became the nucleus of civic life, transmitting values that the king himself sought to embody: compassion, mindfulness, and restraint. Education was not yet formalized as it would be under future rulers, but its spirit had taken root. A child in a village monastery might not know the technical boundaries of Sukhothai's realm, but he would know the name of his king, and he would know what that king stood for. Administrative reforms followed swiftly. The traditional role of the Mueang, autonomous townships governed by local lords, was retained, but now placed under the suzerainty of Sukhothai's central authority. Si Inthrathit avoided the trap of centralizing power too abruptly. Instead, he respected the existing hierarchy of village elders, chieftains, and monks, inviting them into royal councils and encouraging local participation in the decision-making process. This network of shared power ensured that no single region felt dominated or alienated. Trade flourished under this new regime. The fertile plains surrounding Sukhothai had always been rich in rice and other agricultural products, but now those goods could move more freely, unencumbered by imperial tariffs or hostile checkpoints. Merchants from as far as Lan Na and Pagan began arriving in the capital, bringing silk, bronze, lacquerware, and stories of distant lands. The Chao Phraya River became an artery not just of commerce, but of culture. Ideas flowed as easily as goods, and the kingdom, once merely a place of rebellion, was becoming a place of innovation. Even diplomacy, often an afterthought in newly formed states, received careful attention. Si Inthrathit sent emissaries to neighboring principalities, bearing gifts and letters written in a new script developed by court scholars. It was a precursor to the Ram Khamhaeng script that would later standardize the Thai written language, but its significance was already profound. Writing, once the preserve of Angkor's elites, was now a tool of national identity. It marked the transition from oral resistance to institutional memory. One of the most remarkable features of this era was the absence of grandiose declarations or triumphalist rhetoric. Si Inthrathit never styled himself as a god or savior. He did not rename cities after himself or commission epic poems to immortalize his deeds. His legitimacy did not rest on myth but on memory, the memory of what had been endured, and the promise of what would no longer be tolerated. His leadership was quiet, consistent, and deeply personal, but the threat of retribution from the Khmer Empire never fully vanished. Though Angkor was preoccupied with internal dissent and external wars, it had not forgotten Sukhothai. Scouts were seen near the borders. Diplomatic envoys sent from Angkor carried thinly veiled demands for tribute, couched in the language of reconciliation. Si Inthrathit answered with firmness. Sukhothai would not pay tribute, nor would it recognize the authority of a kingdom that had long ceased to serve its people. His rejection was diplomatic but unmistakable, a line drawn in the sand. To guard against retaliation, he ordered the construction of small forts at key passes and river junctions. These were not massive strongholds, but strategically placed and well-manned. Defense relied not on overwhelming strength but on agility, terrain advantage, and the loyalty of local populations. Every village became a watchtower, every monk a messenger. The kingdom transformed itself into a living network of vigilance. The people responded with an outpouring of loyalty. It was not just the nobility or military who rallied behind the king, but the farmers, the artisans, the monks, and the children. During the annual Cathan ceremony, when the laity offers robes and necessities to the monastic community, villagers often added letters of thanks to their king, praising his protection and humility. These offerings, collected and read aloud at court, became a kind of secular scripture, a testament to the bond between ruler and ruled. As the years passed, Sukhothai's example began to inspire other regions. Small Thai principalities to the north and west, once skeptical or wary, now sought alliance or voluntary incorporation. The kingdom grew not by conquest but by invitation. Its borders expanded like ripples on water, gently, steadily, but undeniably. And with each new territory came new challenges, integrating diverse populations, mediating old rivalries, and ensuring that the ideals of self-rule did not devolve into local despotism. These challenges required not only a king but a philosophy of kingship. Si Inthrathit offered just that. He instituted a code of conduct for regional governors, emphasizing the virtues of generosity, humility, and fairness. Corruption was punished not by exile or execution, but by public humiliation and restitution. The shame of betraying the people's trust was often a more effective deterrent than fear. This moral governance, grounded in Buddhist ethics and Thai communalism, became known as the fatherly kingship, a model that would influence Thai political thought for generations. In his private life, the king remained an enigma to most. Little is known of his personal preferences, his daily rituals, or even the full extent of his family. But what is clear is that he was not alone. Behind the scenes, a woman, his wife, whose name history has not preserved, played a quiet yet critical role. She raised their children, mediated disputes among court factions, and advised the king during times of doubt. Though invisible in most chronicles, her presence was felt in the character of the court, in the upbringing of future rulers, and in the soft diplomacy that often averted conflict. She was, in many ways, the soul of Sukhothai. As his reign approached its second decade, Si Inthrathit had transformed from a provincial rebel into a monarch of national consequence. Yet he bore none of the trappings of tyranny. There were no statues erected in his honor during his lifetime, no mandatory oaths of loyalty under pain of death. His power flowed not from fear but from trust, and that trust, once earned, became unbreakable. When he walked through the city streets, still unpaved, still noisy with vendors and children, he was not met with silence or groveling. He was greeted with nods, with prayers, with shared smiles. He was not above the people but of them, and in that belonging, he found the deepest affirmation of his rule. The war of liberation, then, had never truly ended. It continued each day in the choices made by a king who refused to become the very thing he had overthrown. It continued in the fields tilled by free hands, in the temples where monks chanted not out of obligation but faith, and in the hearts of a people who had learned that sovereignty is not a gift granted by gods or empires. It is a responsibility, earned and shared. The chains had fallen, but it was what came after, the forging of something stronger in their place, that would define Si Inthrathit's true legacy. When the banners of the Khmer had fallen and the name of Sukhothai began to echo beyond its riverbanks, the true test of kingship began. It was one thing to overthrow an empire, it was another entirely to build a nation from the wreckage it left behind. The scars of imperial rule ran deep, not only in broken walls and empty temples but in the habits and fears of the people. For years, They had lived under a system in which obedience was the only safety, and ambition the surest path to destruction. Now suddenly they were free. But what did freedom mean in a land where even the concept of self-rule was still being born? Si Inthrathit understood that his victory had given his people a chance, but not yet a future. And so, in the aftermath of revolution, he set about crafting not just a court or an army, but an entirely new order. He did not reach for the model of the Khmer, though its grandeur was still visible in the ruins. He did not imitate the Indian epics or Chinese bureaucracies that had filtered into the region. Instead, he looked inward into the soul of the Thai people and outward toward the land itself. The kingdom he envisioned would not be defined by rigid walls or distant capitals, but by shared values, mutual obligation, and rootedness in place. Sukhothai's power would not radiate outward like a sun, burning all it touched. It would flow like water, adapting, nourishing, spreading life where once there had been only hierarchy and stone. The first step was land. Under Khmer rule, vast swaths of farmland had been owned by religious institutions or noble elites, and peasants toiled under heavy levies. Si Inthrathit initiated a redistribution of these lands, returning fields to the families that had long worked them. It was not a wholesale upheaval. He avoided chaos, but a careful recalibration. Families that had served in the liberation received plots near rivers and irrigation canals. Veterans were given forested tracts with the right to clear and cultivate. The king retained royal estates for the needs of the palace and the monks, but these were modest compared to the vast holdings once claimed by the empire. This land policy did more than feed the people, it anchored them. With ownership came stability, pride, and a reason to invest in the future. It also diffused power, creating a class of independent farmers who owed their livelihood not to a faceless empire, but to a king who lived among them. Alongside the fields, he built roads, not paved boulevards, but raised dirt causeways lined with trees, connecting villages to markets, temples to capitals. These paths were arteries of movement, but also of meaning. They allowed for the flow of goods, ideas, and officials, creating a sense of unity across what had once been isolated valleys and hamlets. Sukhothai was no longer a city-state, it was becoming a body with a heart and limbs and a mind. In the capital, Si Inthrathit began the slow transformation of Sukhothai into a court worthy of its people's hopes. He commissioned buildings not for display, but for service. Granaries to store surplus in times of drought. Assembly halls where village elders could bring grievances, and monasteries where scribes began the task of recording the kingdom's new laws and customs. The architecture reflected Thai sensibilities, open-air structures of teak and brick, adorned not with gold leaf but with carved scenes of everyday life, of lotus flowers and water buffalo, of monks meditating under Bodhi trees. These were not symbols of wealth, but of belonging. The court itself was a curious blend of hierarchy and informality. While Si Inthrathit was addressed with reverence, he rejected the divine pretensions common to many monarchs of the region. He allowed commoners to petition him directly, sat cross-legged in council with village leaders, and often deferred to the advice of elders and monks. His authority was unquestioned, but it was also approachable. In this, he created a new model of kingship, neither tyrant nor priest-king, but a father figure in the truest sense, protective, wise, and deeply human. Religion, too, took on a renewed and central role in the life of the kingdom. Theravada Buddhism had long coexisted with animist and Hindu beliefs, but under Si Inthrathit's guidance, it became the spiritual backbone of Sukhothai. Monasteries received royal patronage, and monks were invited to serve as counselors, judges, and educators. The king himself made regular pilgrimages to sacred sites, often on foot, accompanied by his sons and court officials. One such journey, to a secluded cave temple in the northern hills, became the subject of 1,000 tales. There, it is said, he spent 3 days in silent meditation, emerging with a new sense of clarity about the purpose of rule. Upon returning, he issued an edict affirming the right of every subject, regardless of status, to be heard by the court. Whether legend or truth, the story captured the essence of his reign. introspection leading to action, humility transforming into law. His family, though largely absent from the official records of his early campaigns, now emerged as central figures in the kingdom's development. His eldest son, Ban Mueang, was appointed as governor of a key western province, where he proved himself capable and just. His younger son, Ram Khamhaeng, remained close at his side, absorbing the lessons of leadership with quiet intensity. The king's wife, though still unnamed in inscriptions, held an informal court of her own, mentoring young women, overseeing temple restorations, and mediating disputes among the palace staff. Her influence, though soft-spoken, helped shape the tone of the royal household, a tone of dignity without distance. The legal system evolved under Si Inthrathit's watchful eye. Drawing from Buddhist teachings, Thai customs, and practical needs, the king and his council created a body of law that emphasized restitution over punishment. Thieves, when caught, were made to repay their victims, often through labor or goods, rather than languishing in prisons. Disputes over land were settled through local mediation before escalating to royal courts. Justice was seen not as retribution, but as the restoration of harmony, a principle that resonated deeply in a society still recovering from years of imperial imposition. Education, too, found fertile ground. Monasteries became centers of literacy, where young boys learned to read and write in a script that was slowly evolving into something distinctly Thai. Though still rare, documents began to be composed in the vernacular language, not in Sanskrit or Khmer. This linguistic shift was quiet but revolutionary. It allowed the people to see their thoughts, their prayers, their stories reflected in writing. It was the beginning of cultural self-recognition. As the physical and spiritual infrastructure of the kingdom took shape, so too did its international reputation. Traders from the Mon cities to the south began arriving with goods and praise. Burmese merchants brought lacquerware and silver, speaking of a king who governed with justice. Even Chinese emissaries, long focused on the northern states, took note of Sukhothai's rise. Their records, sparse but telling, describe a peaceful realm governed by a benevolent leader, where roads were safe and the people content. Yet Si Inthrathit never allowed success to breed complacency. He understood that kingdoms, like rivers, must keep flowing lest they stagnate. And so, he continued to travel, to inspect, to listen. He held seasonal gatherings in which delegates from across the realm would present grievances, propose policies, or simply share stories. These events, held in the great clearing outside the capital, became a kind of proto-parliament, a space where the will of the king and the voice of the people could meet. These were not ceremonial pageants but living acts of governance. They reminded everyone, from the wealthiest courtier to the poorest farmer, that Sukhothai was not a fortress of privilege but a field of shared labor. The kingdom's motto, though never carved in stone, might well have been this: "We are strongest when we listen." By the close of the third decade of his rule, Si Inthrathit had done more than anyone thought possible. He had not merely resisted an empire, he had redefined what it meant to rule. In a region long dominated by models of domination and hierarchy, he had offered something radical: kingship as stewardship, power as service, law as compassion. His legacy was not measured in battles won or monuments built, but in the thousands of lives lifted by his hand, in the rice fields where hunger had ceased, in the temples where fear had faded, in the stories told by grandmothers to children under starlit skies. He had forged a kingdom not from conquest, but from trust. And in doing so, he had shown that the ashes of empire could fertilize the soil of something far greater. What remained now was to pass that vision forward. For Si Inthrathit, the future was not his alone to shape. It belonged to his sons, to his people, and to the enduring idea that a kingdom could be a family, and a king its first servant. In the great chronicle of kings and warriors, the names most often remembered are those who wielded power with visible force, who stood upon battlements, led armies across rivers, or signed decrees with thunder in their voices. But kingdoms are not sustained by the roar of leadership alone. Beneath the surface of every enduring realm lies a quieter rhythm, the pulse of memory, of nurture, of hidden wisdom. In Sukhothai, that rhythm belonged to a woman whose name, inexplicably, has not survived the centuries. Yet her absence from the stone inscriptions speaks less to her insignificance than to the silence imposed by history upon women who shaped the world without claiming its spotlight. She was the queen, the wife of Si Inthrathit, the mother of Ban Mueang and Ram Khamhaeng, the matron of a royal house that would define the Thai nation. And though the chronicles refer to her only in the vaguest terms, when they refer to her at all, her presence resided in the daily movements of the palace, the choices of her children, and the moral fabric of a court that prized humility over pomp. She was not a consort kept in gilded isolation, nor a political tool passed between dynasties. She was, by all indications, a sovereign partner in the shaping of a kingdom. Her origins, like much of her story, remain hidden beneath the layers of time. Some scholars speculate that she may have come from a noble Thai family, possibly one of the smaller chieftaincies that aligned with Si Inthrathit during the rebellion against the Khmer. Others suggest she might have been from a Mon or Lao lineage, chosen to cement a regional alliance. Whatever her ancestry, it is clear she brought with her a quiet intelligence, a grounding presence, and a vision for the kind of kingdom her husband was attempting to build. The court of Sukhothai, as envisioned by Si Inthrathit, was not a fortress of seclusion but a living space of governance. And within this evolving structure, the queen played a crucial role, not merely as a hostess of royal ceremonies, but as a curator of culture, an advisor behind closed doors, and a mentor to the generation who would carry the kingdom's legacy forward. She managed the rhythms of palace life with precision, ensuring that rituals were observed, that discipline was maintained among the royal retinue, and that dignity prevailed over indulgence. These were not the duties of a decorative figure. They were the pillars upon which royal legitimacy stood. It was she who oversaw the moral and spiritual education of her children. From their earliest days, Ban Mueang and Ram Khamhaeng were immersed not only in military and administrative training, but in lessons of compassion, patience, and integrity. Their mother ensured that the royal tutors were monks of the highest moral standing, chosen not for their rank but for their insight. She believed that wisdom could not be forced, it had to be absorbed through example. And so she lived in a way that taught her sons more than any scripture could. She rose before dawn to meditate in the temple gardens. She visited the kitchens to speak with servants by name. She sat with grieving widows in silence, and she greeted foreign dignitaries with curiosity, not condescension. Her world was measured not in proclamations but in gestures, each one a thread in the fabric of royal virtue. In moments of political uncertainty, her presence was a stabilizing force. During the early years of Sukhothai's independence, when neighboring city-states tested the boundaries of the new kingdom, it was the queen who organized quiet diplomatic efforts. When emissaries from Lan Na arrived with veiled threats masked as alliances, she arranged for their quarters to be adorned with local art and Buddhist manuscripts that reflected Sukhothai's unique cultural identity, a soft yet unmistakable assertion of sovereignty. In private, she counseled the king not to overreach, to resist the temptation of rapid expansion, and to let the strength of Sukhothai grow organically, from within. Her influence extended to matters of law and justice as well. While Si Inthrathit held formal authority, he often sought his wife's perspective on moral questions. It was she who urged him to emphasize restorative justice in the kingdom's legal codes, to view transgressions not as crimes to be punished, but as breaks in social harmony to be healed. When famine threatened the western provinces one year, it was her advice that led to the creation of grain redistribution policies that would become a model for future reigns. Her compassion was not sentimental, it was strategic. She understood that a kingdom built on fear could never last, but one built on trust could weather any storm. Within the palace walls, she curated a culture of mindfulness. She abolished the practice of forced labor among the court servants, insisting that royal comfort should not be bought at the price of suffering. She converted unused rooms into study chambers for the children of nobles and commoners alike. She invited potters and weavers to demonstrate their crafts before the royal family, reinforcing the dignity of labor and the importance of preserving local traditions. In doing so, she made the palace a mirror of the society it claimed to govern, not a sanctuary of isolation, but a workshop of empathy. Perhaps her most lasting legacy, however, lay in the figure of Ram Khamhaeng. The boy who would one day become Sukhothai's most celebrated monarch was shaped as much by his mother's quiet counsel as by his father's public example. From her, he learned the patience to listen, the humility to serve, and the conviction that language could unite where armies divided. The script he would later create, a phonetic system that gave the Thai people a written voice, was born of a worldview in which every person mattered, every thought deserved expression. That worldview was hers, and yet she never claimed credit. When Ram Khamhaeng rose to power, he honored his father in inscriptions, praised his brother's steadiness, and extolled the virtue of the people, but his mother's name, like her deeds, remained in the background. Some might see this as a historical oversight, a symptom of patriarchal erasure. But in the ethos of Sukhothai, where humility was virtue and ego a vice, her anonymity may well have been her final lesson. In choosing to serve without recognition, she became the model of the selfless sovereign, the architect whose fingerprints are everywhere, even if her name is nowhere. In time, her influence spread beyond the palace. The women of Sukhothai, inspired by her example, began to play more active roles in community life. They organized temple events, led family councils, and mediated conflicts in village courts. Their roles remained informal, but their impact was undeniable. The kingdom she helped shape became a place where femininity was not confined to ornament or obedience, but aligned with strength, wisdom, and moral clarity. As the years passed and Si Inthrathit aged, the queen's responsibilities deepened. She nursed him through illness, mediated tensions between their sons, and ensured the continuity of palace rituals. When the time came for the king to begin transferring power to Ban Mueang, it was she who guided the ceremonial transition, advising both father and son in private. Her composure gave the people confidence, and her unwavering grace lent solemnity to every moment of change. When she passed, no inscription tells us when or how. The palace mourned not as for a consort, but as for a sovereign in her own right. The monks chanted for 7 days, the people offered garlands along the roads, and her absence hung over the kingdom like the silence after a bell. In the decades that followed, her name may have faded, but her presence did not. It lingered in the kindness of the laws, in the rhythm of the schools, in the dignity of the language that now bound a people together. Today, historians speak of Si Inthrathit as the founder of Sukhothai, and of Ram Khamhaeng as its greatest king. But between them stood a woman, a mother, a queen, a teacher who gave them both the tools to lead with wisdom. She did not ride into battle or etch her name into stone, but she built a kingdom all the same. In hearts, in habits, in the quiet power of example. And so, when we speak of the dawn of Thailand, let us remember that it rose not only with the clash of arms, but with the stillness of hands folded in prayer, with the whisper of a mother's voice teaching justice, with the gentle strength of a queen without a name. In the sun-warmed courtyards of Sukhothai, beneath the swaying fronds of tamarind trees and the watchful gaze of golden Buddhas, 2 young boys once played, unaware that their footsteps traced the future of a kingdom. They were brothers, sons of a king who had risen not from nobility but from the soil itself. One bore the name Ban Mueang, the elder, quiet, measured, and dutiful. The other was Ram Khamhaeng, the younger, restless, sharp-eyed, and bold. Together, they would inherit not only their father's blood but his unfinished dream, to build a kingdom that would outlast him, and a legacy that would outlive them all. From an early age, the 2 princes were immersed in a world shaped by philosophy as much as politics. Si Inthrathit, though occupied with the burdens of rule, made time for their instruction. But it was not the cold, formal tutoring of many royal households. Their education was woven into the rhythms of daily life. They were taught beneath temple eaves, on the steps of granaries, at the edges of irrigation canals. They listened to their father adjudicate disputes between farmers and watched their mother kneel to tie a string of flowers for the Buddha's shrine. Every act, no matter how mundane, carried within it a lesson. Ban Mueang absorbed these lessons with steady devotion. He preferred stillness to spectacle, clarity to cleverness. He was often found walking among the fields with village elders, asking about water levels, crop rotations, and family disputes. He spoke rarely in court but always with precision. The people called him the listening prince, for he had mastered the rare art of hearing before speaking. His temperament echoed that of his father, a sense of balance, of moral gravity. In him, Si Inthrathit saw the ideal steward of order. Ram Khamhaeng, by contrast, was a whirlwind. From his earliest years, he had a fire that could not be contained. He ran faster, climbed higher, questioned harder. While Ban Mueang studied ledgers, Ram sat with travelers, demanding stories of faraway lands. He learned languages quickly: Mon, Khmer, and eventually Chinese. He rode horses at full gallop through the rice plains, swam across the rivers of the north, and returned to court with strange relics and stranger ideas. Yet beneath the energy lay an intellect as deep as it was daring. He read the Dharma not for comfort, but for challenge. He did not want to uphold the world, he wanted to remake it. Si Inthrathit understood that he had been given two sons of different spirits, each necessary for the kingdom's future. He resisted the temptation to favor one over the other. Instead, he cultivated their strengths in parallel. Ban Mueang was given increasing administrative responsibility, sent to oversee tax collections, to mediate inter-village disputes, to manage temple land holdings. He did so without complaint, always returning with problems resolved, conflicts soothed, and hearts calmed. Ram Khamhaeng was sent further afield. His father gave him small bands of soldiers and dispatched him to survey border towns, scout trade routes, and represent the court to foreign dignitaries. These missions were more than errands. They were tests of vision, of diplomacy, of courage. In one such journey, he traveled to the northern edge of the kingdom where Thai and Lana borders blurred. There, he negotiated a peaceful exchange of land rights that prevented a border war. He was 16. At court, the people whispered of the contrast between the brothers. Some favored Ban Mueang's serenity, others Ram's charisma. But Si Inthrathit silenced any talk of division. He insisted that his sons sit together in council, decide together in times of dispute, and dine together under the same roof. Their bond, forged in youth, would prove unbreakable in adulthood. Not because they were alike, but because they were raised to see each other not as rivals, but as necessary halves of a greater whole. Their mother remained the unseen guide behind their growth. She spoke with each son in the quiet hours of dawn, offering counsel without command. To Ban Mueang, she gave courage, to speak when necessary, to act when others hesitated. To Ram, she gave restraint, a reminder that vision without compassion can become tyranny. She did not instruct them in the art of war, but in the art of waiting, of weighing, of walking humbly even when the path was clear. As the boys grew into men, their roles became more defined. Ban Mueang was appointed Uparaja, or heir apparent, a title that brought with it not only honor but the heavy burden of continuity. He managed internal affairs, refined legal codes, and supervised the training of future court administrators. Ram Khamhaeng, meanwhile, took command of the kingdom's frontier forces. His campaigns were swift, decisive, and often bloodless. He expanded Sukhothai's influence not by conquest, but by offering security, fair trade, and cultural kinship to smaller principalities caught between larger powers. In time, Si Inthrathit began to withdraw from the daily rigors of governance. Age weighed upon him, and the kingdom he had founded now ran with a life of its own. He spent more time in meditation, in council with monks, and in the company of his grandchildren. Yet even in retreat, he remained the fulcrum around which the royal house turned. When disputes arose between provinces, his voice brought clarity. When foreign courts questioned the kingdom's succession, his hand signed the letters of assurance. And when the people asked who would lead them when he was gone, he pointed not to one son, but to both. This duality of leadership was unprecedented in the region. Most kingdoms placed their fate in the hands of a single heir, risking division or rebellion in times of crisis. But Si Inthrathit trusted in the bond his sons shared, and more importantly, in the ethos they had inherited. His dream was not of dynastic glory, but of shared stewardship. He envisioned a royal lineage that would evolve with the kingdom, not above it but within it. His trust was not misplaced. In 1270, as his health declined, Si Inthrathit summoned his sons to his side. In a ceremony held not in the palace, but in the open temple courtyard where the people could witness, he conferred the symbols of authority. To Ban Mueang, the royal seal and the sword of justice. To Ram Khamhaeng, the sacred conch and the diplomatic ring. These were not mere trinkets, but representations of their intertwined duties, governance and vision, order and expansion, present and future. Shortly after, the great king passed away. The kingdom mourned not with silence, but with ritual. Monks chanted for 49 days. Temples lit lanterns that floated down the river like stars returning to earth. Farmers laid offerings at the base of trees. Children recited his edicts as poems. And through it all, Ban Mueang and Ram Khamhaeng stood side by side. Sons no longer, but successors. Ban Mueang ascended the throne first, as was right. His rule was steady, marked by reforms that deepened the foundations laid by his father. He refined the taxation system, expanded the water infrastructure, and commissioned the first official census of the kingdom's population. His court was quiet, diligent, and profoundly ethical. Ram Khamhaeng did not chafe at being second. He traveled further, deepened Sukhothai's ties with foreign courts, and began developing the writing system that would one day bear his name. He carved stone inscriptions in the vernacular tongue, capturing not only history but sentiment, the laughter of children, the generosity of markets, the beauty of a peaceful dawn. He preserved not just facts, but feeling. In time, Ban Mueang would pass the crown to Ram Khamhaeng without struggle or bitterness. Their bond endured to the end, as their father had hoped, as their mother had prayed. And in that bond lay the quiet genius of Si Inthrathit's lineage, a family not divided by succession, but united by shared purpose. The shaping of a royal line is rarely simple. It can be marred by jealousy, broken by ambition, or dissolved by violence. But in Sukhothai, at the dawn of a nation, a different path was walked. The sons of the founder did not merely inherit a throne. They became the living proof that a kingdom built on trust can endure. The story of Sukhothai would stretch far beyond them. Empires would rise and fall, languages would change, and borders would shift. But the bond of two brothers, and the legacy of the parents who shaped them, would remain carved in stone and sung in memory. They were the sons of a farmer king and a nameless queen, and from their hands grew a nation. When the sun rose over Sukhothai in the early decades of its independence, its light did more than warm the fields and temples. It illuminated the outlines of a new kind of kingdom. Beneath the gentle haze of incense drifting from monastery eaves, beneath the echo of drums marking each moon's passage, a transformation was underway. It was not driven by war or trade or even law, but by faith. And at the center of it stood a king who had built his power not on fear or conquest, but on the subtle, enduring strength of the Dharma. Si Inthrathit understood from the beginning that no nation could be held together by force alone. Empires had crumbled on that very mistake. The Khmer, whose mighty monuments still loomed over the southern horizon, had wrapped themselves in divine kingship, claiming descent from gods, commanding tribute through terror, and building temples that scraped the clouds while the people starved below. Sukhothai would be different, not only in policy but in soul. From the moment of liberation, the king aligned his court with Theravada Buddhism, not as a gesture of personal belief, but as a philosophical blueprint for governance. The Buddha's teachings, with their emphasis on ethical conduct, mindfulness, and the impermanence of all things, offered more than solace. They offered a structure, a model for just rule, for moral accountability, for leadership rooted in humility rather than divinity. The alignment was not purely symbolic. Si Inthrathit invited monks from neighboring regions, Lopburi, Haraphunchai, and even as far as Pagan in Burma, to bring their lineages to Sukhothai. These were not political envoys, but spiritual teachers, men of deep meditation and profound insight. They came not to convert but to consolidate, to build a sangha, a community of monks that could guide both king and commoner. The king granted them land, not barren hills, but fertile groves beside rivers and within city walls. He commissioned the construction of wats or temples, not as palaces for the gods, but as sanctuaries for the people. These temples were open, uncluttered, designed to reflect the quiet clarity of the Theravada tradition. In their courtyards, saffron-robed monks chanted in Pali, the ancient language of the Buddha, and taught the Dhammapada to children too young to hold a plow. Sukhothai soon became a kingdom where the rhythms of the monastic calendar shaped public life. Upasatha days, observances of the moon cycles, became occasions not for fear of celestial wrath, but for introspection, fasting, and generosity. The people brought rice, robes, candles, and incense to the temples, not as taxes but as acts of merit. Merit-making became the moral economy of the kingdom. It tied peasants and nobles alike into a system of reciprocal virtue, where giving was not loss but gain, where kindness was wealth, and where the king himself modeled the highest form of giving service. Si Inthrathit was not merely a patron of the Sangha. He was its student. He regularly received monks in private audience, not to command them but to learn. He sought their counsel on legal matters, on public health, on education. He allowed their voices to challenge his own, and in doing so, strengthened the legitimacy of both the throne and the robe. In the chronicles that would later emerge under his son, it is said that the king spent several weeks each year in silent retreat, meditating in forest monasteries far from the capital. Whether literal or metaphorical, the story captures a truth, that power to endure must bend before wisdom. The relationship between the Sangha and the crown was not without tension. Some monks criticized the court's spending on military fortifications. Others challenged the leniency of certain legal reforms, arguing that too much compassion could weaken order. But these debates were welcomed, not silenced. In Sukhothai, religion was not a tool of the state, nor was the state a pawn of the monastery. They were twin pillars, checking, balancing, and elevating one another. Under Si Inthrathit's reign, the status of the monkhood rose dramatically. Monks were not confined to temples. They served as village arbitrators, traveling teachers, and healers. They advised local governors, recorded oral histories, and in times of drought or flood, led communal rituals to restore harmony. Their authority was moral, not administrative, but it was deeply felt. A rebuke from a revered monk could carry more weight than a royal decree. The educational reforms of the era owed much to this monastic influence. The kingdom had no formal schools, but the temples became de facto academies. Boys, and occasionally girls, spent months or years as novice monks, learning to read and write, to chant and reason, to debate ethics and memorize parables. They emerged not only literate but literate in compassion, instructed in the causes of suffering and the means of its cessation. Language itself was reshaped by this religious shift. The inscriptions of the time, etched in stone and memory, reflect a transition from Sanskrit to Pali and finally to the vernacular Thai. This linguistic evolution mirrored a spiritual one, from foreign imposition to native expression. The written word became a vehicle not for empire, but for empathy. Royal edicts were framed as conversations, not commands. Laws were inscribed with explanations, not just punishments. The very tone of governance softened, became more human. Art too changed. Under Khmer rule, sculpture had emphasized grandeur. Gods towering over mortals, kings carved in the image of Shiva or Vishnu. In Sukhothai, the Buddha became the central figure, not seated in stoic rigidity, but walking, smiling, inviting. The walking Buddha of Sukhothai, with its elongated limbs and gentle posture, conveyed not dominance but grace. It was a visual theology of kindness, rendered in bronze and stucco, visible in every town and village. The fusion of faith and statecraft reached its quiet climax in the rituals of the king himself. Si Inthrathit never styled himself as a Chakravartin, a universal monarch, or claimed divine sanction. Instead, he adopted the title Dhamaraja, the righteous king. His legitimacy derived not from conquest or inheritance, but from his adherence to the Dharma. His palace ceremonies mirrored monastic ones. He fasted on Upasatha days. He gave alms each morning. He judged not by whim but by precept. When foreign emissaries arrived, from Lan Na, from the Mon cities of the south, from as far as Pagan, they were struck not by the gold of the palace but by the gold of silence, of discipline, of inner wealth. They returned home not with tribute, but with tales of a kingdom where the king meditated before he ruled, where the laws were written in plain language, and where the temples outnumbered the guard towers. Yet this deep alignment with Buddhism did not make the kingdom passive. Si Inthrathit did not conflate compassion with weakness. He understood that protection was part of his sacred duty. When border skirmishes erupted, he responded decisively, but always with an eye toward resolution. He sent monks as envoys before he sent soldiers. He treated captured enemies not as criminals but as future allies. In one notable incident, a band of raiders from the east was not executed but fed, clothed, and sent home with letters of clemency, and within a year their village petitioned for alliance. The moral clarity of the king set the tone for the court. Ministers were expected not merely to obey, but to reflect. Corruption was not punished with torture, but with public confession and restitution. Court officials were encouraged to meditate, to study the Jatakas, the Buddha's past lives, and to see their work not as self-enrichment but as merit-making. The kingdom became, in effect, a mandala, a sacred circle, with the Dharma at its center and all actions spiraling outward in harmony. As his sons matured and took on more responsibility, they inherited not only the structures of state but the spirit of it. Ban Mueang continued his father's policy of integrating monks into governance. Ram Khamhaeng, with his genius for language, began inscribing royal edicts that blended law with philosophy, turning the king's voice into a moral compass. Their mother, ever the guardian of spiritual discipline, ensured that the palace remained a place of simplicity, where robes outnumbered jewels, and where silence was honored as much as speech. In this way, Sukhothai became more than a political entity, it became a spiritual experiment. A place where power bowed to wisdom, where leadership meant listening, and where the crown was not a symbol of control but a reminder of responsibility. The legacy of this experiment would ripple across centuries. Future Thai kings, even as they adopted new customs, would trace their lineage to Si Inthrathit not merely by blood but by example. The ideal of the Dhamaraja would become the gold thread that ran through Thailand's royal fabric, sometimes bright, sometimes frayed, but never broken. In the twilight of his reign, Si Inthrathit spent long hours in the temple groves, walking barefoot on earth he had once bled to free. He no longer sought to expand his realm. His gaze had turned inward, toward the kingdom of the heart. He knew that the walls of a palace could crumble, that armies could fail, that even sons could stray, but that a kingdom founded on the Dharma would endure, invisible and invincible. And so, when he passed from this world, the people did not weep for a ruler lost, but gave thanks for a path illuminated. The crown was passed, the robes continued their daily rhythm, and the Buddha walked on in bronze, in breath, in the footsteps of a farmer's son who had once dreamed of justice, and who had made that dream real. For all its serenity at the center, the early kingdom of Sukhothai lived within fragile perimeters. Its rice fields were green and tranquil, its temples humming with chants and incense. But beyond the forested hills and rivers that marked its outer edge, the world remained turbulent. The collapse of Khmer authority in the region had created not only freedom for Sukhothai, but a dangerous vacuum, an absence of order into which ambition and fear spilled like floodwaters. And as Si Inthrathit and his sons labored to build a kingdom of justice and wisdom, the shifting alliances and hungry neighbors that surrounded them reminded them that peace, no matter how devoutly pursued, required vigilance. To the west, the kingdom of Haraphunchai still clung to its Mon Buddhist roots, proud and wary, its monks venerable but its nobles suspicious. To the north, the rising power of Lan Na, ruled by a young and capable king named Mangrai, cast a long shadow. To the south, the remnants of Khmer control still lingered in isolated garrisons, fueled by resentment and the delusion of reconquest. And to the east, loosely organized Thai and Lao principalities, driven by competing clans and warlords, posed an ever-shifting puzzle of diplomacy and provocation. These edges, blurred, permeable, and often contested, presented Si Inthrathit with his most persistent challenge. Unlike the clear moral vision that had guided the liberation of Sukhothai, the realm of foreign policy and military defense was murkier. Here, the Dharma could offer principles, but not strategies. Here, wisdom required not only compassion, but calculation. The first of the border crises arose less than 5 years after Sukhothai's independence. A tributary village along the Moe River, claimed both by Sukhothai and by a minor vassal of Haraphunchai, was raided in the night. Its rice stores were burned, its monks humiliated, its people scattered. Though the culprits were likely bandits acting without state sanction, the political consequences were immediate. The people of the village appealed to Si Inthrathit for protection, and Haraphunchai, in turn, accused Sukhothai of fomenting rebellion. The king responded not with an army, but with a caravan. He dispatched a delegation of monks, mid-level officials, and a detachment of soldiers not bearing weapons, but carrying food, medicine, and lumber to help rebuild the village. He sent a letter to the Haraphunchai court, written in both Pali and Mon, acknowledging the confusion and proposing joint stewardship of the border zone. The response was wary but measured. An uneasy truce was reached, and a local council, composed of monks from both kingdoms, was established to mediate future disputes. This episode, though small in scale, revealed the complexity of Si Inthrathit's diplomacy. He understood that Sukhothai's strength lay not in its army, which was modest and mostly defensive, but in its legitimacy. He wielded reputation as a shield, presenting Sukhothai as the kingdom of peace and reason in a landscape churning with instability. But he was not naive. When another incident occurred, this time, a border outpost ambushed and its garrison slaughtered, he acted swiftly and without hesitation. Ram Khamhaeng, then still a prince but already commanding great respect, led a punitive expedition into the hills, routing the warband responsible and restoring the outpost. The young prince's action was not merely military, it was psychological. He brought back the bodies of the slain Sukhothai soldiers, held a public funeral with full honors, and then personally supervised the construction of a new temple at the site of the ambush. The message was clear. Sukhothai was not weak, but principled. It would forgive when possible, but never forget when duty was violated. Justice and mercy would walk hand in hand. As Ram Khamhaeng's reputation grew, so too did Sukhothai's need to navigate its place in the patchwork of Thai principalities to the east. These were regions not yet consolidated into kingdoms, clusters of villages and strongmen, often feuding, sometimes uniting briefly under charismatic warlords. They were culturally kin to the people of Sukhothai, but politically unstable and prone to being manipulated by larger neighbors. Si Inthrathit, ever the strategist, took a long view. Rather than attempt to subjugate or annex these regions, he extended a web of cultural and economic ties. He sent monks to teach, artists to collaborate, and merchants to trade. Over time, Thai communities outside Sukhothai's formal borders began adopting its script, celebrating its festivals, and using its coinage. Sovereignty in this model did not require occupation, it could be achieved through resonance. Still, not all neighbors welcomed Sukhothai's rise. In the north, Lan Na under King Mangrai was forging its own vision of unity. Mangrai was ambitious, disciplined, and shrewd. He admired Sukhothai but had no intention of deferring to it. His campaigns to unify the northern valleys were relentless, and his spies moved with silent speed. Si Inthrathit recognized in Mangrai not a rival to be crushed, but a mirror, a fellow builder of order in a disordered time. The two men never met in battle. Instead, they met through messengers, through letters penned in elegant Pali, through gifts exchanged between courts. When conflict loomed, both stepped back. When opportunity arose, both took it. Ram Khamhaeng was sent to Lan Na as an envoy, and he returned impressed by Mangrai's administrative reforms. Later, Mangrai would send architects and astrologers to study Sukhothai's urban design. It was a relationship defined not by war, but by wary respect. The southern frontier was less stable. Khmer remnants, still clinging to fading authority, launched sporadic raids into Sukhothai territory. These were not coordinated campaigns, but desperate acts by commanders unwilling to accept the empire's decline. One such raid, aimed at a supply convoy bound for a newly built temple, resulted in the death of a revered monk. The outrage was immediate, and public sentiment called for retribution. Si Inthrathit once again turned to his son. Ram Khamhaeng led a retaliatory strike deep into Khmer territory, not to conquer, but to dismantle. He targeted fortifications, burned abandoned garrisons, and captured the warbands responsible. But then, in a move that stunned many, he released them. Fed, healed, and dressed in fresh robes, they were sent back with a message carved into a wooden tablet. We return life, not death. Learn from this. This act, recounted for generations in temple murals and children's tales, became emblematic of Sukhothai's doctrine of strength tempered by restraint. It was not pacifism but enlightened defense, a belief that might was justified only when guided by principle. Still, the border tensions never fully disappeared. Drought years brought new waves of migration from the east, creating friction in Sukhothai's frontier villages. Traders smuggled weapons disguised as grain. A new cult arose in a neighboring principality, proclaiming its leader as a reincarnated bodhisattva destined to rule all Thai lands. Si Inthrathit responded not with persecution, but with clarity. He invited the leader to Sukhothai for debate. The man declined, and his movement withered without confrontation. This pattern repeated itself across the king's final decade. Tension, response, reform. The kingdom became more adept at absorbing shocks, not through expansion, but through coherence. Its borders were still marked by uncertainty, but its core grew stronger with each trial. Each new generation born under the Dhamaraja knew their place not only on a map, but in a story of freedom earned, of peace defended, of justice that reached even to the margins. In the capital, monks recorded these events not as conquests, but as moral episodes. The Sangha taught that the kingdom's true territory was the mind, that every act of restraint was a victory, every act of compassion a fortress raised. Soldiers trained in martial arts also learned the Jatakas. Administrators studied not only revenue but rebirth. The state and the soul were inextricable. Si Inthrathit, now graying and often walking with a staff carved from sacred figwood, spent his days listening. He listened to border reports, to merchant stories, to peasant petitions. But he also listened to silence, to the wind in the palace garden, to the chanting of novices, to the steady, tireless pulse of a kingdom holding itself together in a world that seemed always to pull things apart. He knew that empires fell not only from outside but from within. He had seen it in the Khmer, who had lost their humility long before they lost their battles. He had seen it in minor lords who grew intoxicated with temporary power. And so he insisted, to the end, that his sons continue what he had begun, not merely the defense of land, but the defense of a way of being. When he died, the border outposts did not erupt in panic. The soldiers lit candles. The monks offered prayers. The villages rang their bells, not in alarm but in remembrance. The edges of the kingdom remained intact, not because they were impenetrable, but because they were known. And within them, a people endured, quiet, watchful, and free. The border wars had not defined Sukhothai, but they had tested it, and it had passed. with courage, with discipline, and with a king who understood that the hardest battles are often fought not with swords, but with patience. The final years of Si Inthrathit's life unfolded like the closing verses of a sacred chant, measured, solemn, and full of quiet resonance. The king who had once marched barefoot through forest paths to free his people from imperial rule, who had knelt in monastic silence to hear the breath of wisdom, who had forged a kingdom not with might but with merit, now found his strength slowly receding. The rhythms of statecraft, once pulsing through his veins, began to slow. His legs, once swift enough to scale the earthen walls of Sukhothai in battle, now required a cane carved from the wood of an old fig tree. His voice, once commanding in court, took on the tone of a grandfather telling stories not to instruct, but to preserve. Time had not diminished his mind. His thoughts remained clear, his judgments incisive. But his body, weathered by decades of service, spoke more honestly each passing season. What once had been morning audiences filled with ministers and monks became afternoons spent in temple courtyards, listening more than speaking. What had once been circuit rides across the provinces became private visits from governors and messengers. And what had once been a palace brimming with construction and expansion was now a space of stillness, a sanctuary for remembering what had been built and for preparing what would endure. It was not illness in the traditional sense that weakened him. No sudden fever, no dramatic affliction. It was a slow erosion, a gentle slipping away that he recognized with neither fear nor denial. He had watched the seasons pass too many times to believe that anything, no matter how noble, escaped impermanence. The Buddha had taught it, the monks had chanted it, and now, his own bones bore witness. All conditioned things arise and pass away. And yet, there remained work to be done. He called for Ban Mueang first. The elder son, long his partner in administration, had already assumed many of the duties of governance. He was no longer a prince, but a de facto ruler in all but name. The people accepted him. The court respected him. He governed with the same calm precision that had defined his youth. When he entered the room where his father rested, he did not kneel as a subject, but stood as a steward awaiting the next charge. The conversation was not lengthy. The king asked about grain storage, about the behavior of certain lords in the western provinces, about the water levels in the canals. Ban Mueang answered each question plainly. Then, in a moment that was less ceremony than culmination, the king handed him the ring of royal seal. It was an object of simplicity, a disc of carved wood set with copper, bearing the emblem of the Bodhi leaf and the walking Buddha. It had no jewels, no crown. But in that gesture, a torch passed from one hand to another. Later, he called for Ram Khamhaeng. The younger son had never been meant for stillness. He had spent the last years traveling between cities, mapping borderlands, drafting inscriptions, speaking with sages and kings. His mind was a constellation of ideas, and his heart beat in rhythms shaped by both curiosity and conviction. But when he sat beside his father's bed, he was a son again. They did not speak of succession. They spoke of people, of the farmers in the northern plains who had once hidden rice from Khmer tax collectors, of the monks who had arrived from Harafunchai and stayed to teach the Dharma in local dialects, of the children who now traced their first letters in a script Ram himself had begun to shape. They spoke of wind and river, of loyalty and silence, of the space between rule and wisdom. When the moment came, the king gave Ram Khamhaeng not a title, but a responsibility. He placed a weathered manuscript in his hands, a copy of the Dhammapada written by a monk who had fled Angkor decades ago. It had traveled across mountains and centuries, copied by hand through storms and wars. Its pages were brittle, its ink faded, but in it were the principles that had built Sukhothai: mindfulness, compassion, discipline, and truth. "This is not a weapon," the king is said to have whispered, "but it holds more power than any blade you will ever carry." The younger son bowed, not as a prince to a king, but as a disciple to a teacher. As days passed into weeks, and weeks into the final months of the year, Si Inthrathit withdrew further from the outer world. He no longer attended councils. His meals were simple, his days marked by long silences broken only by birdsong and the occasional recitation of verses. He walked each morning to a small shrine beneath a Bodhi tree planted in the early days of his reign. There he would sit not as a king, but as a man returned to earth. The people of Sukhothai knew of his decline, though no proclamations were made. Word spread not through decree but through presence. Farmers who came to the capital noticed the absence of the royal chariot in the streets. Monks who once debated in the palace courtyard now chanted beneath his window. The city did not mourn preemptively, but it listened. And in that listening a gentle preparation began. Temples were cleaned. Candles were molded in silence. The royal artisans, without being told, began shaping a funerary stupa of modest height and great elegance. Its design was based on a lotus in mid-bloom, a symbol of impermanence, yes, but also of realization. The architects used no marble, no gold, only sandstone, lacquered wood, and the memory of a reign lived without ostentation. In his final week, the king spoke little. When he did, it was to his wife. Her name was never recorded in the inscriptions, but her presence had shaped the kingdom as deeply as his own. She sat beside him, holding his hand, reciting verses from memory, reminding him of old festivals and of the sound of rain on their first shared roof. Their words were not of rule or power or legacy. They were of the ordinary things that kings are often too busy to notice, until it is too late. When the end came, it came with grace. There was no struggle, no pain, no outcry, only a breath, and then the space where breath had been. The king who had once borne the weight of an entire people's hope slipped from the world as gently as he had entered it. The kingdom did not erupt in panic. It breathed. The funeral was held 7 days later, not in the palace, but in the temple field where monks and commoners could gather. Tens of thousands came on foot, by ox cart, by raft. They carried no weapons. They carried rice, flowers, candles, and silence. The ceremony was led not by generals or nobles, but by the abbot of the first monastery Si Inthrathit had founded. He spoke not of titles but of teachings. He did not name the king's victories, but his virtues. He reminded the people that the Dharma is not born, and therefore does not die. After the chants, Ban Mueang lit the funeral pyre with a steady hand. Ram Khamhaeng stepped forward with the manuscript, the same one his father had entrusted to him, and placed it beside the king's folded robes. It was not consumed. It was retrieved afterward and placed in the library of the royal temple. It remains there, they say, to this day. In the weeks that followed, the transition of power was seamless. Ban Mueang ruled with dignity and clarity. Ram Khamhaeng continued his travels, now not as a prince, but as a sage in training. The people did not compare them to their father. They did not need to. His presence was everywhere, in the design of their roads, the tone of their justice, the words of their prayers. And so Sukhothai entered a new chapter, no longer carried by the hands of the founder, but walking on the path he had traced. A kingdom built not in defiance of an empire, but in alignment with conscience. A throne that had never needed a crown to be holy. And behind it all, the memory of a man who had once been called Ban Mueang, just a local leader, just a farmer's son, who had dared to believe that peace could be stronger than war, that wisdom could guide politics, and that kingship, at its best, was simply another form of service. He did not live forever, but what he built did. When a king dies, it is customary for a nation to look back, to count the victories, to weigh the errors, to dress memory in ritual and prose. But when Si Inthrathit passed from the world he had shaped, Sukhothai did not merely look backward. It looked inward and then forward. The silence left in his wake was not hollow but full, like the pause between verses of a sacred chant, charged with breath and purpose. For his death had not left a void, but a foundation. And upon that foundation, his sons and his people would build not in his shadow, but in his light. Ban Mueang ascended the throne without protest, without factionalism, and without the fanfare that so often cloaks succession. His coronation was simple, held in the temple courtyard beneath the Bodhi tree where his father had once meditated. There were no parades, no foreign dignitaries, no gilded processions. Instead, there were offerings to the monks, prayers spoken in a dozen dialects, and rice shared from a single great pot among nobles and villagers alike. The message was unmistakable. The new king would not rule by spectacle, but by continuity. He governed as he had always lived, quietly, with precision and calm resolve. His first acts as king were not proclamations of change, but affirmations of rhythm. He retained his father's ministers, reaffirmed alliances with neighboring provinces, and expanded the canal systems that fed the kingdom's fields. His laws bore the same moral tone as those of Si Inthrathit, compassionate, restorative, and accessible. In one of his earliest edicts, he reduced temple taxes for remote villages, ensuring that their spiritual centers would not falter for lack of rice or robes. But Ban Mueang was more than a steward. He recognized that the moment demanded not only preservation, but preparation. The kingdom was stable, but the world was not. Rumors from the north spoke of Lan Na's growing strength under King Mangrai. To the east, new Thai principalities were emerging from the highlands, eager to test their strength and seek their own identity. And within Sukhothai itself, a generation was coming of age who had never known Khmer rule, who knew only the language, laws, and ease of a kingdom born in righteousness. Ban Mueang turned to his brother, not as a subordinate but as an equal. Ram Khamhaeng, still formally a prince but already a legend in whispers, returned from his travels to serve beside his brother in what became one of the most harmonious co-regencies in Thai history. Their relationship, forged in childhood and tempered in the crucible of their father's vision, allowed them to divide their responsibilities with elegance. Ban Mueang remained at the center, anchoring the administrative heart of the kingdom. Ram moved along the edges, speaking with merchants, soldiers, poets, and monks, absorbing the mood of the realm and carrying back both warning and wisdom. Where Ban Mueang was the steward of structure, Ram Khamhaeng was the herald of culture. It was during this time that he accelerated the development of the Thai script, refining symbols, standardizing usage, and commissioning stone inscriptions that recorded not only laws and treaties, but the rhythms of daily life. These inscriptions were more than records, they were mirrors. For the first time, the people saw their language etched in stone, saw their thoughts dignified by the permanence of writing. In a world where literacy had long been the preserve of monks and kings, Ram's inscriptions invited even the commoner into history. One such inscription, placed at the base of a stupa erected in memory of Si Inthrathit, began not with titles, but with sentiment. My father was a good man. He taught me how to speak gently, how to sit among monks, how to listen to the wind and know when it brings rain. These were not the words of empire. They were the words of a son remembering a man, and of a nation remembering itself. Under Ban Mueang's guidance and Ram Khamhaeng's vision, Sukhothai entered a golden maturity. Trade flourished not only with neighboring Thai cities, but with the wider world. Merchant caravans from China, India, and the Malay world passed through its gates, drawn not only by goods but by the kingdom's reputation for fairness and peace. Foreign emissaries marveled at the cleanliness of the streets, the literacy of its monks, and the quiet confidence of its people. They returned home not with conquest stories, but with tales of a place where the king dined from clay bowls and where the law could be recited by a farmer. The shadow of Si Inthrathit loomed, not as a burden, but as a guide. His memory became the moral compass of the court. When governors bickered, they were reminded of the founder's patience. When monks grew complacent, they were reminded of his humility. When generals pressed for expansion, they were reminded of his restraint. And when the people questioned what it meant to be Sukhothai, they found their answer in the walking Buddha, the open palace, the quiet rice fields, that is, in the kingdom he had dreamed and built. Even as new generations rose, those who had known Si Inthrathit in life became living scriptures. Old soldiers told stories of his first battles. Monks recounted his visits to jungle temples, his barefoot pilgrimages, his way of sitting quietly and making even silence seem royal. Children were named for him, His image, though never formalized into idol worship, was painted on the walls of village schools and carved discreetly into the sides of temple bells. But legacy is not only what is remembered. It is what is chosen. Ban Mueang and Ram Khamhaeng did not merely preserve their father's world. They interpreted it. They saw that Si Inthrathit's true gift was not a finished kingdom, but an unfinished invitation. He had offered a model of rule that placed ethics above ambition, reflection above impulse, and community above hierarchy. Their task was to extend that model into a changing world. And change it did. In the 11th year after Si Inthrathit's death, Ban Mueang quietly passed the crown to Ram Khamhaeng. There was no ceremony, no power struggle, no shock. It was as if the kingdom itself had anticipated the shift. Ban Mueang retired to a monastery in the Eastern Highlands, where he spent his remaining years in study and meditation. His decision was not abdication, but succession in its highest form, a voluntary yielding for the good of the realm. Ram Khamhaeng's reign would become the most celebrated in Sukhothai's history. His name would echo beyond borders. His script would shape a people, his diplomacy would link rivers to oceans. But he never claimed the title of founder. That place belonged eternally to his father, the man who had refused to be called divine, who had walked beside monks instead of leading them, who had chosen the name Inthrathit, not to dominate but to remind himself that even a king should aspire to righteousness. In the decades after Ram Khamhaeng's ascension, the temple that held Si Inthrathit's ashes became a place of pilgrimage, not only for royalty or clergy, but for potters, weavers, and farmers. People came not to pray for favors, but to sit in the garden where he had once sat, to leave flowers beside the Bodhi tree he had planted, and to whisper their hopes into the same wind that had once cooled his brow. In time, the stupa weathered. The tree shed its leaves and grew them anew. The capital expanded, contracted, changed names, changed rulers. But the story remained. It was told in every village where a child first learned the script he could call his own, in every courtroom where the judge quoted not only law but wisdom, in every monastery where a boy first shaved his head and chanted the same verses that had once comforted a dying king. The death of Si Inthrathit had marked the end of one journey, but the legacy he left was not static. It moved with his people, shaped their aspirations, and guarded their conscience. It lived not in monuments, but in manners, not in legend, but in the language of daily life. And so, the founder became more than a historical figure. He became a presence, felt in the rice harvest, heard in the morning bells, seen in the quiet eyes of a just ruler. His kingdom endured not because he held it tightly, but because he had taught it to let go, to grow, to choose wisely. The rise of his legacy was not a resurrection. It was a continuation, and in that continuation, a nation found not only its past, but its future. In the centuries that followed the death of Si Inthrathit, the stones of Sukhothai shifted. Rain wore down the temple steps he once climbed. The Bodhi tree he planted shed its final leaves and fell in a storm whose name no one remembered. The palace walls, once strong with purpose, cracked and surrendered to vines. Empires rose beyond Sukhothai's borders. Lan Na expanded northward. Ayutthaya grew to the south. Names changed. Languages evolved. The world spun onward. But not everything faded. Among the ruins of old capitals and the pages of forgotten chronicles, there remained a presence, a gentle, enduring pulse that belonged not to marble or manuscript, but to memory. It moved in the shadows of bells, echoed in the rhythm of poetry, lingered in the curve of a script carved into weathered stone. It was the memory of a man who had not set out to become a legend, but to serve his people. And in serving them, he became the quiet root from which a nation grew. Si Inthrathit never ruled over a unified Thailand. He did not command vast armies across the entire peninsula, nor did he build towering monuments that bore his image. His kingdom, by the standards of later empires, was modest, geographically limited, temporally brief, and yet, in the hearts of his descendants, he came to symbolize something greater than conquest. He became the idea of a nation before the nation had a name. It was not his birth that made him revered, but his choices. In an age where kings claimed the sun and moon as their ancestors, Si Inthrathit claimed the rice field and the plow. In a region where palaces rose in tiers of marble and gold, he chose halls of teakwood and open courtyards. Where others ruled through spectacle and fear, he governed with stillness and principle. And where others sought to be remembered in stone, he lived in such a way that he would be remembered in silence. His sons carried his vision forward, expanding Sukhothai's reach, refining its laws, elevating its culture. But even in their accomplishments, they never surpassed the purity of his intention: to offer his people dignity, voice, and peace. As centuries passed and dynasties changed, each new ruler who invoked justice did so, whether they realized it or not, in his shadow. Even Ayutthaya's mighty kings, surrounded by wealth and ceremony, quietly referenced Sukhothai's founding ideals when facing crises of legitimacy. The memory of Si Inthrathit was preserved not by power, but by repetition, by generations who told his story not for entertainment, but for grounding. Monks recited his life as part of their lessons in compassion. Schoolchildren copied his name while learning the alphabet Ram Khamhaeng refined. Village elders reminded young headmen of his humility before sending them to mediate disputes. He became the moral archetype of kingship. Not flawless, not superhuman, but fully present, anchored in values, consistent in vision, selfless in purpose. In time, monuments were built, not by his command but in his honor. The most enduring among them stood not in the royal city, but in a field near the riverbank where he had once walked with his people. It was not tall nor particularly ornate, a seated statue, with a scroll in one hand and the other extended in a gesture of offering. Around him were carved panels depicting scenes of daily life: farmers at work, monks in procession, children learning script. The statue did not elevate him above the people, it placed him among them. Pilgrims did not bow out of fear, but out of recognition. They saw in him what they wished for themselves: a life of service, a legacy of kindness. And so, the man whose reign had lasted only a few decades came to define not an era, but a spirit. His influence moved beyond maps and boundaries. It traveled with monks across rivers, with merchants across mountains, with exiles who carried little but memory. His name was whispered in times of unrest, invoked in moments of restoration. During periods of tyranny, dissidents recalled his gentleness. During foreign invasions, soldiers remembered his courage. During the rise of nationalism, poets turned to his story as the thread that bound a fragmented people. In the 19th century, as the modern Thai state began to define itself amid colonial pressures and internal reform, the memory of Si Inthrathit was called upon anew. Historians, artists, and political thinkers sought to craft a narrative of Thai identity that reached beyond recent dynasties. They returned to Sukhothai not for its military prowess, but for its spirit. They unearthed its inscriptions, studied its architecture, and declared it the dawn of Thai civilization. But even in this renewed reverence, Si Inthrathit remained elusive. There were no detailed biographies, no journals, no self-glorifying chronicles. All that endured were fragments: his title, his deeds, the echoes of his voice through the generations he had touched. And perhaps that was the final lesson he left: that greatness is not built on visibility, but on presence. That a nation's soul is not forged in marble, but in mercy. That kingship, at its highest form, is not dominion, but devotion. Modern Thailand, with its glittering temples and bustling cities, carries his imprint in ways most cannot name. In the continued centrality of Buddhism to public life, in the moral vocabulary of its leadership, in the elegance of its script, the grace of its language, the quiet discipline of its rural heartlands. His flame burns in the stories told by grandparents, in the verses memorized by schoolchildren, in the acts of compassion that still mark the best of the country's civic life. There is a phrase often spoken during royal ceremonies in Thailand: to uphold the legacy of righteous kings. It is recited solemnly, its origins older than most remember. But at its core, It speaks of one man who, centuries ago, stepped into the vacuum left by a fallen empire. Not with ambition, but with clarity. Who led not to rule but to restore. Who rose not because he desired power, but because his people needed someone to hold the center. That man was Si Inthrathit, and though his bones have long returned to the earth, his spirit endures, in fields and temples, in words and silence, in the shape of a nation that still walks, still hopes, and still bows before the idea that a good man, guided by wisdom, can change the world.